Hello, this is Domenico with Easynomics, and today we're going to look at the imposition of an indirect tax in microeconomics on the consumer as opposed to the producer. This is not on the IB syllabus, but perhaps for an internal assessment, this could be a model that you can use if you're encountering an article where the government is imposing tax directly on the consumer. In this video, I'm going to break down the impact of that tax in a little bit more detail, very similar to this video, where we really dug deep into understanding the behavior of consumers and producers when an indirect tax is applied on the producer. And then I'll show us a more simplified example of the model, which you can use on an exam or an internal assessment. The real-world example, which is recent, is coming from Bali, which is charging a tourist tax to address over-tourism as a form of negative consumption. This is coming from Shift, which is a tourism industry online magazine. And in this article, it highlights that the tax is fixed at $10 per tourists. So that would cause the demand curve to shift in parallel by that amount. So the vertical distance between the D1 curve and the D2 curve that we'll see in the model will be $10, which is equivalent to 150,000 Indonesian rupiah. The article highlights how the tourist can pay directly to the government through a government website, a mobile app, or upon entry within the country at the airport or seaports. Why are tourists being taxed now? This is a result of a sudden influx of tourists coming into the country, predominantly from Russia, Eastern Europe, China. Russia, we can equate with the Russian-Ukrainian war, Russians deciding to leave their country. Perhaps they're worried that they might be drafted into the military. Maybe they don't want, I'm making assumptions here that they don't want to be part of the war effort. So they're leaving and residing elsewhere. And the number of tourists coming into Bali has increased. We see the numbers here. Bali has had over 5.3 million foreign tourists visiting in 2023, up from 2.2 million in 2022. So that's a sudden increase in demand for tourism services within Indonesia. It also puts pressure on aspects of their infrastructure. One aspect of their infrastructure is transportation. This has led to significant increases in traffic congestion, traffic jams, as tourists have increased the number of cars being consumed and used on roads within Bali, and also increased the number of motorbikes consumed and used in Bali. That leads to excessive numbers of vehicles on the road, on narrow roads, reducing the ability of locals to travel from point A to point B. So that's a negative consumption externality. In addition, that generates a lot of waste. That volume of people coming to Bali generates a significant amount of perhaps food waste and other forms of waste. And can Bali process that vast quantity of waste? Here's another article from Lonely Planet, also focusing on this, the imposition of this tax on tourists. It goes on to how tourists can pay to the government, and also explains why Bali would prefer less demand by tourists for their services. Again, some numbers. The island of 4.3 million saw 6.3 million people visit in 2019. This is the year before the pandemic, up from just 2.2 million a decade prior. March of last year, some negative consumptions behaviors from these tourists, the over-tourism. A Russian citizen was deported for a photo showing him pantless at a sacred Hindu site. Tourists have been captured in the same month screaming and lunging at religious security officers. And so that creates a lot of negative consumption that locals as a third party are being negatively impacted by. In addition, it says that Bali deported 289 foreigners in 2023, perhaps due to behavior and other issues. There was also a proposal of, let's set a quota, a limit on the number of tourists that can come into the country. It seems to be in debate, hasn't taken effect. And here's another government website from Denmark explaining to people how to pay, and also highlights the tax revenue will be collected by the Bali government to be reallocated towards positive production, increasing funding for their ability to maintain sustaining their resources, perhaps amplifying their infrastructure so it remains clean, their ability to process waste and so forth. So that could be all forms of positive production. So let's get into the model. So here we have graph A, market for tourism, goods and services in Bali, with an applied tourism levy on consumers. This graph A will be a little bit more complex, a little bit more depth provided to it. Graph B will be in the more simplified model that we can use for paper exam or an internal assessment. Graph B, market for tourism, goods and services in Bali, with an applied tourism levy on consumers, and that will focus on the negative consumption. So graph A, we have price measured on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis, our upward sloping supply curve for goods and services provided by producers equal to the marginal cost of providing them. Then we have our downward sloping demand curve by tourists for those goods and services equal to their marginal benefit. And that provides a free market equilibrium at point A with a free market price at PE and free market quantity at QE. But then the Bali government steps in and they apply a tax. In the same way that a tax causes the supply curve to shift upward by the amount of the tax, a tax on the consumer causes the demand curve to shift downward by the amount of the tax. So we're going to draw a second demand curve here. And I'll label this D2, which is equal to D1, and this will be minus the tax. The consumer is really operating along their D1 curve. D2 is reflective of what they're willing and able to pay before the tax. So D1 minus tax. So that takes us to point B. So that's going to give us a price that consumers are willing and able to pay. Let's say I'll call this price 1 just for now. Price 1. At that price of price 1, this is the quantity that consumers are willing to consume prior to the tax being added. And then we add the tax, and that takes us to PE, which could be P1 plus the $10 tax. Okay, so what we effectively see here is the demand curve shifting in by the amount of the tax. Okay, now there's a problem here. So P1 is what a consumer is willing and able to pay before paying the tax for this quantity of QE. But producers are not willing to provide that quantity of QE at that price. Instead, we see a reduced quantity at this point. Let me just fix that a bit. So here we have point C. Okay, and this would be the quantity of supply for these goods and services at that lower price versus the quantity of demand at that price prior to the tax. And so here we see there's excess supply, and that would put upward pressure on price. And it's going to eventually take us to this new equilibrium right here. ABC, I'll call this point D. Okay, so we see that if we're following this demand curve, the tax would have the effect of causing a reduction in the quantity of demand from point B to D and increasing the quantity of supply from C to D if this is the price that's being paid by the consumer prior to the tax received by the producer prior to the tax, taking us to that new equilibrium. But what actually happens? The consumer is really operating, again, along their D1 curve, and they're going to reduce their quantity demand to this new quantity. So let's mark this quantity here. And let's go up to this point. So in the same way that the quantity of demand is decreasing from point B to D, all right, or let's say from, let me use a darker color, from QE to quantity with the tax. All right, in the same way we're going from point B to D along the D2 curve, the quantity of demand decreasing. We want to keep in mind that the consumer is really operating along their original D1 curve. And so they're decreasing their quantity of demand from point A to point E. Okay? That will be the price that they are going to eventually pay with the tax. So we're going to label this price paid by the consumer. So here we have the price that they are willing to pay with the tax. If we subtract the tax, we're at point D. All right, D2 being what you're willing and able to pay before the tax. And that's going to lead to a reduction in the quantity of supply from point A to D if the firm is operating along their supply curve. All right, so we see a reduction in the quantity supply, which takes us to Q tax. And then here we have the price received by the producer. Price received by the producer. And then we can see the tax being collected. So this is a bit more involved explanation, trying to understand what is going on. It's not necessarily what you'd be doing on an IB exam. But again, I'm trying to highlight the D1 curve is what consumers are willing and able to pay as their final price. The D2 curve is reflective of what consumers are willing and able to pay prior to the imposition of the tax. So if we are at point B, I'm willing to pay this quantity before the tax is applied. But at that price, at P1, that creates a problem because producers are only willing to supply at QS. So here we have that shortage. It puts upward pressure on price, and the price goes to price received by the producer, P and P. That's the price received by the producer. Then we add the $10 levy, and this becomes the price paid by the consumer. So it takes us to a new quantity of Q tax. Okay? A little bit too involved, or maybe a little bit too complex to explain it that way. So we're going to use graph B to keep it simple. But let me just highlight the tax revenue. Here we have, in this rectangular area, oops, that's a little bit too, let me try again. Use a lighter color. Here we have the tax revenue collected by the Bali government. Maybe I can make it a little bit darker here. Okay, and we see that similar to a tax on the producer, it has the effect of increasing the price paid by the consumer from PE to PC, and then it also reduces the price received by the producer from PE to P and P. Okay, let's use graph B. Let's simplify this. So here we have graph B, market for tourism for goods and services in Bali with the applied tourism levy on consumers as a negative consumption externality. Here we have our supply curve equal to our marginal private cost of production, which is equal to our marginal social cost of production. Providing goods and services to tourists is not generating a negative externality. It's coming from the demand side. Here we have D1 equal to the marginal private benefit, and it's excessive amount of demand for this quantity in the free market at QM, providing a price at PM. The Bali people, the Bali government, Bali society would prefer a much lower demand for their tourism services. And so we'll label that here at D2, which equals the marginal social benefit. All right, and that would provide an optimal price, social optimal price at P opt, and a social optimal quantity at Q opt. So the government of Bali and its people would prefer reduced consumption for their tourism services, where MSB equals MSC. Let's highlight the welfare loss. Right? The welfare loss exists at the free market within this triangular area here. Here we can see that the marginal social cost, the marginal social cost at QM is greater than the marginal social benefit at point B. Social optimum would be achieved at point C, providing an optimal price, P-opt, and optimal quantity at Q-opt. How can the Bali government achieve this? Well, they're going to impose this $10 levy. The $10 levy is going to cause the demand curve to shift in by the amount of that tax from D1 to D2. Okay, so here we'll have D2 equal to the marginal social benefit, which is going to be equal to D1 minus the tax. All right, so D2 is reflective of what consumers are willing and able to pay before they pay that tax. That would have the effect again of shifting the demand curve in from D1 to D2, and that would take us to price at optimum, but that becomes the price received by the producer. That's going to increase the price paid by the consumer. And the price paid by the consumer is increased to PC. Okay, so here we can label perhaps another point, A, B, C, and D. And there we have our model of how a tax on the consumer shifts that demand curve in. It raises the price paid by the consumer from PM to PC. It lowers the price received by the producer from PNP to equal to P-opt. We achieve social optimum because we have effectively reduced the quantity from QM to QOP. Hopefully we're going to get a few less tourists coming to Bali. And then it also generates tax revenue for the Bali government so that they can amplify their infrastructure to handle the level of waste generated by the amount of tourists, while also spending money to sustain and preserve their resources and their natural resources and so on. Okay, so let's analyze graph B as we would for an IB exam. Graph B is the market for tourism for goods and services in Bali with an applied tourism levy on the consumer being an example of a negative consumption externality, over tourism as a negative consumption externality. On the y-axis, we're measuring price. The x-axis, we're measuring quantity. We have an upward sloping supply curve equal to our marginal private cost, equal to our marginal social cost of providing tourism services and goods. Then we have our downward sloping demand curve according to the law of demand. D1 equals the marginal private benefit to the foreign tourists that are enjoying those goods and services. It provides a free market price at PM and QM where MPC equals MPB at point A, but we notice that at QM, the marginal social cost is greater than the marginal social benefit. The social cost of providing all of these goods and services to all of these tourists coming in is exceeding the social benefit, and it's generating a welfare loss, which is the triangular area between points A, B, and C. That triangular area represents the negative consumption generated by tourists that are not respecting maybe local customs and rules, that they're consuming cars and motorbikes and increasing traffic, that they're generating collectively excessive food waste and sanitative waste, and that is having a negative effect on locals within Bali. Thus, social optimum would be achieved where MSB equals MSC at point C, providing an optimal price at P-opt and optimal quantity at Q-opt. How will that be achieved? Well, the government comes in and they apply a tourism levy equal to about $10 that the consumer is responsible for paying when they enter the country or prior to entering the country by paying through a government website. That would have the effect of shifting the supply curve inward since taxes are a non-price determinant from D1 to D2, D2 equal to MSB, which is equal to D1 minus the tax. D1 would be equal to what a consumer is willing and able to pay with the tax. D2 is what the consumer is willing and able to pay before they pay that tax. Thus, that sets an equilibrium where S1 equals D2, or where MSC equals MSB at point C, and that will lower the price received by producers from PM to P-opt, which is equal to PNP. That will lower the price because we're going to get a reduction in the quantity of demand for goods and services from Q in to Q out. So that's going to reduce some total revenue for hotels and restaurants and so forth. In addition, it increases the price paid by consumers. Now they're internalizing the externality by paying that $10 from PM to PC. And that generates tax revenue. The tax revenue is going to be equal to the price paid by the consumer minus the price received by the producer times the quantity at tax. The government can collect that tax, they'll be better off. They can use that revenue to increase their infrastructure, perhaps amplify their transportation systems, provide more public transportation so people are not using cars and motorbikes, amplify their infrastructure for provision of water and sanitation, and also preserve their natural resources. As mentioned before, total revenue for firms is reduced. We can mention that in our evaluation. Total revenue initially was PM times QM, but then it is reduced to total revenue 2, which equals to the price received by the producer, multiply it by the reduced quantity of tax. And we can visualize that for a moment. The original quantity or total revenue was this rectangular area here. And then it is reduced to this rectangular area here. Okay, and that's it. In the video notes below, I'll have an analysis of this model. If you have any questions, feel free to comment those questions below. And don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.